say good evening to everybody and welcome everybody back to our speaker program.
Good evening.
Everyone, which has now happened, including me. No, I'm not muted. So everyone's now muted. We've got viewers again from around the UK and international. But tonight, could I make a special welcome to our friends from one of our joining clubs, Rotary Clubs Harlow Tie. Tonight, we also have a number that have shown interest in our club during the last few months, who are, of course, very welcome. So some housekeeping, as I say, everyone will be muted. And when it comes to questions, either raise a hand or use the chat box. There's lots of screens, so we've got 2 pages of screens in front of us, so it's difficult to catch everybody. So it's become traditional in these talks that I invite Peter Blaskos to share with us some of his words of wisdom. So give us a chance, Peter, and we'll unmute you first of all.
Yes, I'm unmuted, I think. Can you hear me all right?
The stage is yours, Peter.
Thank you very much. Yes. Tonight we return after our August recess to resume our Zoom meetings. A great success. Nick will give us the farmer's view of life after Brexit, which will be quite new. Have faith. Businesses will make sure that sense will ensue to give a working arrangement for trading with EU.
Thanks very much, Peter. Now, Peter has just had his hip replaced 2 weeks ago, or 2.5 weeks ago, and making an amazing recovery. Well done, Peter.
Thank you.
Right, I would now like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Nick von Westenholz. Now, he spoke to us about a year ago. Nick is a farmer farming near Woodford and a director for European Exit and International Trade for the National Farmers Union. Through his role for the NFU, Nick's primary focus is, of course, the farming sector, but he also gets a good insight into what else is happening. We are reaching, very obviously, a very critical point in our negotiations with Europe, and our fate, the politicians tell us, will be determined over the next 4 weeks. So Nick has agreed to take questions following his talk, and I'm sure there's many of us on tonight that would like to know what's really happening. So Nick, if I can find you, I will unmute you, and there you go. I think you're unmuted, and it's over to you, Nick.
Great, thank you very much, Gordon. Evening, everybody. Hope you can hear me clearly. I mean, obviously, it's a vast topic, and as Gordon said, I wanted not just to sort of focus on farming, although it's almost impossible to talk about Brexit and some of the international trade issues at the moment without talking about food and farming, because they're so central to lots of the debates, but also to talk a little bit about the politics which is going on. And obviously in the last few days that's heated up quite significantly as well. But I'll try and leave quite a lot of time at the end for questions as well. I think we're finishing at about 8:30, so it's, as I say, it's such a wide topic. There's usually lots of questions. I'm very happy to answer as many as I can. I thought maybe the best place to start, as Gordon said, I did speak to the Rotary a year or so ago, was maybe to kind of step back in time and remember where we were a year ago, and then sort of move forward from there as a way of explaining some of the challenges and looking at the situation as it stands today. So you will, of course, remember back sort of September and October last year was a very sort of frenzied political time. Boris Johnson had been Prime Minister for a couple of months, and it looked, as it sort of does now, as if leaving the EU without a deal was the best bet in town. But then at the last moment, he sort of pulled a deal out of the fire. and agreed the famous withdrawal agreement with the EU, and he put that to Parliament. But of course, at that time, a year ago, when he put it to Parliament, it was the old Parliament, the hung Parliament, the Parliament that Theresa May had so many problems with, and that Boris Johnson was finding equally problematic. And his withdrawal agreement failed to get through the parliamentary process, which I think, if you look closely at what happened, was as much by design probably from Boris Johnson as it was Parliament. It was probably 6 of one and half and dozen of the other why that deal failed in Parliament. But of course, that then really did present the opportunity for him to call a general election. And so we had the campaign, the election in December, and the resounding victory for Boris Johnson's Conservatives, an 80-seat majority, which is a pretty sizable majority in anybody's estimation. And that allowed him then to do what he said he would do, which was to get Brexit done. And even though it might not feel like it at times, we did, of course, then leave the EU in January of this year. So for all intents and purposes, Brexit was done at that point. But of course, we're now discovering that it hasn't really been done at all, and there are lots of issues that still need resolving. So if we take a step back to January, the key two documents, or the key two elements of Brexit were, on the one hand, the withdrawal agreement, which is once again causing so many problems, and on the other hand, something called the political declaration, which set the scene for the negotiations with the EU for the future relationship. The withdrawal agreement, in fact, was very, very, very similar to Theresa May's withdrawal agreement. It's about 95% identical. The main difference, indeed pretty much the only difference, was the way it dealt with Northern Ireland. And what it did, and again what we're sort of discovering now, although many people knew at the time, but what the media seemed to be discovering, is essentially it's put a border down the Irish Sea. Even if the Prime Minister denies that that's what's happened, it's very clear that has what happened. And by that, what I mean is that there is now, or there will be, a different status for Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain. Northern Ireland is, for all intents and purposes, part of the EU's single market and will remain so. And of course, the rest of Britain will be outside it. And so, without getting into too much detail, what that really means is goods going to and from Northern Ireland across the Irish Sea will be subject to different checks, different regulatory rules, etc. And that will mean they will require different paperwork. There will be some cost to it. And actually, Northern Ireland will be, in a way, more similar from a regulatory point of view to the rest of the EU, certainly to the Republic of Ireland, than it will be to Great Britain. Now, I won't go into the politics of whether that was the right or wrong thing to do. It was clearly the thing that Boris Johnson said he wouldn't do, but it was at the same time the thing that unlocked the deal and allowed him to get the withdrawal agreement through and to leave the EU as he had promised at the end of January. So the Northern Ireland bit of the withdrawal agreement is what's rearing its head again now, and I'll come again to that in a bit. The other main bit of the withdrawal agreement was the details of the transition period, which is what we're in at the moment, and that essentially said nothing changes. So at the moment, we are legally and formally no longer a member of the EU, but practically we remain a member of the EU and still subject to EU laws and regulations. That, of course, ends at the end of the year, and there was an option to extend that, and the Prime Minister was very clear from the outset that he wouldn't extend that, and he hasn't. And so we are indeed leaving one way or the other at the end of the year, and that is why there is such a tight timetable on the negotiations at the moment. So we've had 11 months essentially since the 1st of February or we will have had 11 months by the end of the year, since the 1st of February, to resolve the future trading relationship with the EU. And I'll kind of expand on the 4 key areas that that entails. So firstly, it's the trade relationship with the EU. We have for the last 45 years, certainly the last 20 or so years since the inception of the single market, had a very free, frictionless trading relationship with the rest of the EU. Essentially, to trade with France or Germany or anywhere else is the same as trading with Telford or Cornwall or pick a place in the UK. It's entirely frictionless. And of course, that has come with a cost in terms of us having to pool sovereignty with those other EU member states and having to lose some control over the rules and regulations and laws that we as a country wish to legislate for. So the question that remains unanswered is what that relationship looks like from January next year. And the Prime Minister has been fairly clear that it is not going to be as free and frictionless as it has been in the past. And there is this very simple balance in a way between, I think, sovereignty and taking back control and free trade. And despite the Prime Minister and the government's many speeches praising the benefits of free trade and describing Britain as a leader of free trade, it's clear that the approach to the relationship with the EU is in the other direction. It's about raising trade barriers, raising costs of trade, and in order to take back an element of control and sovereignty. Again, I'm not commenting on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is very clear there's a balance there. And this, the Prime Minister has decided that sovereignty and taking back control is the main prize. So the question mark really over the EU relationship is about how much friction, how much cost, and how many barriers to trade will actually exist from January next year. I will talk at the end about the risks of no deal, but even with a deal, it is likely to be an increase in the costs of trade and in doing trade with the EU. The second area is our trade relationships with other countries. And this is obviously sort of now being supercharged. We're in negotiations with a number of countries around the world, the obvious one being the US. You'll all be aware, and I'm sure reading the various media reports of what is and what isn't going to be included in a UK-US deal. But those negotiations are ongoing, and in fact, they are developing quite quickly. They're going forward. They won't be done by the end of the year. The US presidential elections will see to that, but certainly the negotiations are continuing. The other 2 key priority ones for the UK are Australia and New Zealand. And Australia, again, is going quite fast. New Zealand, not quite so fast, but those are ongoing as well. You then have another category of trade negotiations, which are what are called the rollover deals. So these are the deals which the EU already has with certain countries. And therefore, these aren't new trade relationships as such. But the risk is, as having left the EU, those deals fall away, and we suddenly find ourselves in a worse situation where we don't have trade deals anymore. So that includes Japan, Canada, Mexico, and indeed there are about 40 others in total. Many of those have already been re-signed. They're not better deals or worse deals, they're essentially just replicating what we had before. But the key ones are with those slightly bigger countries that I mentioned, Mexico, Canada, and Japan. And they're a little bit more controversial because each of those countries probably gave away more than it might have wanted to when they did deals with the EU. That's natural. EU is an enormous economy. Those countries, while big, are much smaller, and so there's an imbalance of power. Now that they're doing a deal with the UK, they don't want to give so much away, and that's why we're seeing, you might have seen, there's a little bit of controversy over the Japan-UK deal, which was supposed to have been tied up a couple of months ago. but has stalled because Japan don't want to give the UK a quota on Stilton cheese. It always seems to be cheese and agricultural products which end up being a spanner in the works of these trade deals. But it's maybe reminding us the reality of how difficult sometimes these trade deals are. The countries we're negotiating it with us don't want to do favours for us for no reason. If they're going to give us something, they want us to give something back. So so those trade deals, those rollover deals as they're called, are proving a little bit tricky as well, but they should be fairly straightforward to do because the text is already there, the framework of those deals are already there with the EU, and it's just a case of largely transferring them over and ironing out a few sticking points. But what that does mean is we are, as a country, negotiating concurrently an awful lot of trade deals, many more than any other country probably has negotiated concurrently. And it's a bit of a concern for a couple of reasons. Firstly, this is basically new for us. The UK has had trade negotiators working within the EU, but for political reasons, many of those weren't brought home after the referendum. So we've kind of had to be training up a new cadre of trade negotiators. And they're often very bright, very good, but they're not necessarily experienced. They happen also to have picked some of the fiercest trade negotiators across the planet to do trade deals with first. I think it might have been easier to have picked a couple of countries in sort of sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East to start off with, but instead we are negotiating with the US. Australia, New Zealand is small, but has a fearsome reputation as a trading nation because that's basically what it does, and the EU, and they are pretty much the toughest trade negotiators in the world. So that's proving tricky. And I think what we've seen over the last couple of months, which is a little bit of the ambition of doing all these trade deals quickly and having them done by the end of the year, that ambition is falling away as the reality of what's involved with these trade deals comes to pass. I think they will be done. They're just going to take a little bit longer, and they're probably not going to be quite as comprehensive as was originally envisaged. And one of the reasons for that is trade deals aren't what they used to be. It used to really be about tariffs. You engaged in a negotiation, and basically what you were trying to do is get that country to reduce its tariffs on the goods you were trying to sell to them. And in return, you would reduce the tariffs on the goods you would import from them. And obviously you would try and get as good a deal as you could, but it was as simple as that. Trade deals in the last 20 or 30 years have become much more about rules and regulations, about standards, and about countries wanting to impose their standards on their negotiating partners, particularly if they're smaller. And this is interesting because I think one of the reasons we left the EU, we voted to leave the EU, and this is particularly pertinent to farming, which has operated under EU regulations for many years to the ire of many farmers. But one of the reasons we left, I think, was the feeling that we were required to follow rules and regulations which we didn't necessarily, as the UK, have control over. But I think what we're now finding that actually if you want to do a trade deal with anybody, that's the reality. So when you hear the arguments about chlorinated chicken, which is, for my sins, one of the things I spend my life talking about and talking to journalists about, but when you hear those arguments about the US wanting to export chlorinated chicken, they are sensational, but they are essentially true. The US has a very different regulatory approach to food than the EU and the UK, and the US would like the UK to recognise its regulations so that it can trade more easily with us. And that would mean, for example, that we would have to accept chlorinated chicken as a safe and reasonable way to rear chicken. Now, I don't want to get into the details of chlorinated chicken. I'm very happy to answer questions. All I will say is it's not the chlorinating of the chicken that is the problem. It's the rearing of the chicken in conditions that don't look after its health that require the chlorination at the end of the process that's the problem. So it is actually an animal welfare issue, not a health issue. We drink chlorinated water, we wash our salad and lettuce in chlorine. Chlorine is not a problem, but if you allow poultry to be reared in bad conditions, then it's chlorination is what is required. So these are the sorts of issues suddenly we're realizing happen all over the world. This isn't just a kind of EU issue, it's an issue with everybody. Even Australia, as I said, Australia trade deal is really coming down the tracks quite quickly, but in Australia, they allow the use of hormones in their beef production system. That's outlawed in the UK, it's outlawed across the EU, but it's part of the Australian system, and the Australians are happy with that. That's how they manage their farming. But they will say if we want to do a deal, then we should look at allowing hormone-treated beef. It'll probably be a bit different with Australia. They're actually a smaller economy than the UK, so they have a lot less clout. And it might be that they accept that they'll have to only sell hormone-free beef into the UK market or something like that. But when it comes to the big superpowers, EU, US, and indeed China, the deal is essentially you follow our regulations if you want to do a trade deal with us. And that's now why there's, I think, a little bit of reticence and confusion about what the UK's trade priorities ought to be. So that's the second area. First was around the relationship with the EU, second, trading relationships with the rest of the world. The third area, briefly, and it is, and I mention it because it's particularly relevant to farming and to some other sectors, is around the end of free movement. So from the 1st of January, Europeans will not be free to come to the UK to take up jobs, residence, etc., in the way that they currently are. Instead, we're adopting a new points-based immigration system, the details of which we still haven't seen, but the idea is that it'll be in place from the beginning of January. The UK farming and other sectors like healthcare, nursing, quite a lot of the hospitality industry have relied quite heavily on EU labour for many years. For farming, which is the only industry I can speak for, it's often painted as, well, that's just cheap labour and tough, we'll have to now go and get labour from elsewhere. But actually there's been lots of efforts over the years to try and source labour from the UK. And in fact, up until the pandemic, unemployment in the UK was very low. So there wasn't a lot of labour to draw on in terms of filling many of those jobs. And there is now a big concern about where those jobs are going to come from, particularly because the new immigration system is going to focus on high-skilled immigration. The idea is we have an immigration system that has a salary threshold, and it encourages people here to take higher salary and higher skilled jobs. And lower skilled jobs in the economy are filled by UK workers. Now, this has all been a bit muddied by the pandemic, because obviously there is suddenly a pretty high level of unemployment in the economy. And so actually it may be that there is more domestic labour than there used to be to fill these jobs. But it is worth, and you might have seen some of the news reports noting that over the summer, there was a number of campaigns getting UK workers who had either been furloughed or lost their jobs during the pandemic to take on farming roles. There was something called the Pick for Britain campaign, for example, and in its which was great and did find a lot of local people who wanted to take on these roles. But it has had a massive impact on productivity. Sadly, these guys are just not as good at doing those jobs as many of the Eastern European workers who used to come and take those jobs have been. Make up your mind why that is. But there have been real struggles in getting those people into jobs and actually keeping them as well. Unfortunately, a lot of those people came in, found the work quite tough, and decided that it wasn't for them. So we still got quite a shortfall in labour, particularly in fruit and veg picking in the UK. So there's a big question mark over how things are going to work next year. The truth is, in an advanced economy like the UK, there is always a reliance on overseas labour for lower skilled jobs. And it's difficult to know and to understand how the new immigration system, with its focus on high skilled labour, works with a high wage advanced economy like the UK. I guess we're going to conduct a bit of an experiment, and we'll find out. The final area, and this is very farming specific, and I won't bore you then with too many details, but is a whole new farm subsidy system. So for many years, UK farmers have operated under the Common Agricultural Policy and have received support payments for that, which has essentially been tied into the ownership and the farming of land by area. Most countries around the world subsidise their farmers in one way or the other. Essentially, it's what underpins the fact that you can go to Tesco's and buy a loaf of bread for 80p or a pint of milk for 40p. And the way that operates across the world is in many different ways, but essentially subsidies are generally aimed at supporting the production of food without doing it in an openly trade distorting way. The UK has now decided to take a very different approach, which will be pretty unique across the world, which is to pay farmers irrespective of whether they are farming and producing food, but instead for the delivery of what they call public goods. So for things that the market itself doesn't pay for, environmental goods, so biodiversity, wildlife, rich meadows, flood alleviation schemes might be something that could be paid for, climate change initiatives, all of these things. Now, on the face of it, that's quite interesting, and certainly I wouldn't want to be negative about the importance of some of those sorts of measures, but it is a problem if you want your farmers to continue to produce food in an affordable way. And it's particularly a problem if at the same time for our farmers, if going up the list again to trade policy, you're going to start importing cheaper food produced to lower standards. And that's a big concern for us. A lot of these trade deals are essentially going to incentivize imports of cheap food, in itself maybe not a bad thing, but which has been produced in ways that would be illegal for UK farmers to produce. And I think there's a big question mark, A, whether that's fair, and B, whether actually consumers want that. Now, you could say, well, consumers can choose through buying behavior. They don't have to buy the stuff. But when you buy a pie or when you buy a ready-made meal, I'm sure you will cook from fresh, but some people will buy ready-made meals, or when you are eating food in a hospital or in a school or in even a cafe or a restaurant or pub, you don't know where the food has ultimately come from most of the time. And there will be a big incentive for cheaper food produced to lower standards to come into that part of the market. So big changes coming for UK farming. All of this is a bit up in the air at the moment, particularly around that new farm subsidy system, which is still being worked out, even though it's going to start coming into play from next year. And if I'm being honest, this is creating quite a lot of anxiety amongst farmers. We see confusion over what our trade relationship with the EU is. And remember, we about 60% of our exports of agri-food go into the EU. We buy about 70% of our imports in agri-food from the EU. So it's an incredibly important market. And we don't know what that trading relationship will look like. We don't know what farm subsidy system will be in place starting from next year. And we don't know whether we're going to be able to source sufficient labour from next year. So there's a lot of uncertainty and frustration because it's still not being, much of this is still not being resolved. Final point, or final final bit of the talk before I move on to questions. What happens next? Deal or no deal? Firstly, I'm very cautious about doing predictions. I'm sure the last time I spoke to you, I did a prediction, probably on the same basis that I would be cautious about it, and I can't remember what it was, but it no doubt was wrong. I think when I'm pushed on this, and about twice a day at the moment, I get asked, is there going to be a deal? I think if I was really pushed, on balance, I'd say yes, there's still more likely to be a deal than not. I couldn't tell you what the details of that deal would be. And I couldn't even say whether it's definitely going to come into effect from the 1st of January or whether there might be a little bit more of an implementation phase for a few months into next year to allow businesses to prepare. But I certainly think no deal is more likely than it's ever been. Last year, we were in this situation on 3 occasions. We're heading towards leaving without a deal. Not one of those occasions did I think it was particularly likely that we would leave without a deal. Primarily, that was because of the hung parliament, the political situation, and the difficulty that actually eventually came to pass for a government getting no deal through. That doesn't exist anymore. If this government wants to leave without a deal, it can and it will. So the big question is, does it? Does it want to leave without a deal? And I think that's a big unknown. One school of thought says, yes, they want to cut all the ties, which would then provide them with the freedom to pursue some of Dominic Cummings's, more ambitious ideals of providing massive state support to the technology sector and a few other bits and bobs. There are others saying that the negative impact of that, and there would be a negative impact, particularly on farming, would be something that the Prime Minister wants to avoid at all costs. Take your pick. Could be either, but for farming in particular, no deal is particularly problematic. And I'll give you one example. At the moment, our sheep farmers export about 35 to 40% of their total production. I think we're the 3rd largest sheep exporter in the world. And nearly all of that, those exports go into the EU. A lot of it to France, other parts of Western Europe, Ireland. And of course, at the moment, as I said at the beginning, that all goes in absolutely tariff-free, completely frictionless. Selling your sheep meat and lamb into France is the same as selling it into Northumberland if you're a Welsh farmer. Overnight on the 1st of January, without a deal, a 40% tariff would be applied to any sheep meat going into the EU. And our estimates is that would mean an immediate price drop of 30% on UK sheep meat. As it happens, actually, UK sheep meat's doing quite well at the moment. First time in about 20 years. The price isn't too bad, but still, that would basically make sheep production pretty much unviable. It would certainly be a heavily loss-making enterprise. And as I said, that would come in overnight if there was no deal, because across the board we would suddenly face tariffs on all our trade into the EU. Whatever happens, we're going to be facing checks, delays, paperwork, fees. Some things will have to be stopped at the border and physically checked, particularly farm products, meat, fresh produce, etc. That all will basically happen from the 1st of January unless there's an implementation period anyway, deal or no deal. So the last thing to say, we are with our National Farmers Union members really trying to prepare them now for the 1st of January, because all that's happened in the last 4 years and a bit since the referendum has really been the sort of phony war. It's all been business as usual. Things change. For the first time, things will change for better or for worse from the 1st of January. It will start to look very different. And if it's no deal, it will be pretty disruptive for a few months. But as I said, it could be either. I will finish there. I've kind of whizzed through a whole host of different topics quite superficially, so I apologise for that, but I'm very happy to answer as many questions as I can.